46%. That's how many points Alex Iala won on her own first serve against Belinda Bencic in Toronto. 46%, on the shot that's supposed to be the one advantage a server always has over a returner. On tour, that number should sit somewhere in the 60s for a player performing at Eala's level. 46% isn't a bad day. It is a red flag flashing in exactly the spot analysts have been pointing at for over a year. Here's the real answer, right away. Eala didn't lose to Bencic because her legs gave out, and she didn't lose because Bencic suddenly played out of her mind. She lost because the one part of her game that critics, coaches, and even rival players have quietly flagged for months, her serve, finally got exposed on a stage and against an opponent built specifically to punish it. This wasn't a fluke. This was a pattern catching up to her at the worst possible moment. Now let's unpack how we got here, because once you understand the history behind this criticism, the Toronto loss stops looking like a random bad day. Go back than Toronto, Washington, and further even than this entire breakout season. The conversation about Eala's serve isn't new. It's been following her since she first started climbing the rankings, and it hasn't gone away no matter how many big wins she's stacked up. Analysts who break down her matches point to specific numbers that don't lie. Her first serve regularly averages somewhere in the mid-80s miles per hour range. Her second serve drops even further, down into the mid-70s. To put that in context, plenty of players on the WTA Tour are hitting first serves in the 100 to 110 mile per hour range on a regular basis, with second serves comfortably above 85 or 90. Eala's numbers sit well below tour average on both counts, and that gap doesn't close just because she's winning matches elsewhere in the game. This isn't a secret take from one random commentator either. It's a recurring theme across breakdown after breakdown. Coaches analyzing her matches have specifically called her serve the most identifiable technical flaw in an otherwise complete game. Fan communities that follow the tour closely have pointed out the exact same thing independently, describing her second serve in particular as easy pickings for opponents who know how to step in and attack it. Even after one of her biggest wins earlier this year, when she beat a former world number one, the story afterward wasn't just about the win itself. It was about how remarkably slow her serve numbers were throughout that entire match, numbers so low that they became their own separate headline days after the result had already been celebrated. So why does this matter so much? Because in modern tennis, the serve isn't just one shot among many. It's the foundation everything else gets built on. A big serve does more than win outright points. It sets up easy first ball attacks. It relieves pressure in tight moments. It gives a player a reliable escape hatch when a game gets tense, a way to manufacture a free point or a short ball to attack instead of having to grind out every single point from the baseline. Players without that escape hatch have to win nearly every point the hard way, through movement, through rallies, through sheer competitive will. That's an exhausting way to play tennis over the course of a long match, an even longer tournament, and an entire grueling season. It's also exactly the kind of approach that becomes unsustainable the moment fatigue, or a particularly good returner, enters the equation. That's the setup. Now let's talk about why Bencic, specifically, was the perfect opponent to expose this particular flaw at this particular moment. Bencic isn't known as a devastating power hitter. She's not going to blow anyone off the court with pure pace the way some players on tour can. What she is known for, and what makes her dangerous against exactly this kind of matchup, is her return game. She reads serves early, she gets her racket on the ball cleanly, and she's built a career out of taking mediocre or slow second serves and turning them into immediate offense rather than just neutral defensive shots. Against a big server, Bencic has to work to generate that kind of offense. Against a slower, more predictable serve, she doesn't have to work nearly as hard because the ball is already sitting up in her strike zone, giving her time to load up and attack from the very first shot of the rally. Look at the actual match numbers again with that context in mind. Eala's first serve percentage sat at just 58%, meaning well over 40% of the time she wasn't even getting a first serve in, forcing her into second serves that, as we've already established, sit in that mid-70s mile per hour range. And when her first serves did land, she still only won 46% of those points. That's not just below average, that's a number that suggests her opponent was reading and attacking the serve with real confidence, not just surviving it defensively. Compare that to Bencic's own service numbers from the same match. She was serving at a noticeably higher first serve percentage, and crucially, she was winning a significantly higher percentage of points behind that first serve too. That gap, between what Eala's serve was generating for her and what Bencic's serve was generating in return tells you almost everything you need to know about how the tactical battle of that match actually played out, separate from any conversation about fatigue or physical exhaustion. This is the part where the story gets more layered, because it's not that fatigue and the serve issue are two competing explanations that cancel each other out. They're connected, and understanding how they connect is what actually explains Toronto fully. A slower, more hittable serve is a liability in any match, on any day, against any decent returner. But it becomes a much bigger liability specifically when the player behind that serve doesn't have the physical freshness to compensate for it in other ways. Think about what compensating for a weak serve actually requires physically. It requires extra movement on the very next shot, because a rally that starts on the opponent's terms instead of your own means you're playing catch-up from ball one instead of dictating position. It requires longer rallies overall, because without a free point machine built into the serve, nearly every service game turns into an extended battle rather than a quick hold. It requires sharper reflexes and faster reactions at the net and along the baseline, because a returner who's comfortable stepping in on your second serve is going to generate more first strike opportunities than a returner facing a bigger, more intimidating serve. Now overlay that reality onto everything Eala's body had already been through by the time she walked onto the court against Bencic. Remember the stretch she'd just completed. A title run in Washington that ended with a 3-set comeback final against a top 3 player, closed out with 9 straight games in an emotionally and physically draining third set. A 3-set battle against Alicia Parks just 48 hours later, solving a matchup that had beaten her badly earlier in the season. A hard-fought first set against a Grand Slam champion in Coco Gauff, before that match ended in retirement. 7 matches, 2 tournaments, almost no true recovery time anywhere in that stretch. On a completely fresh body, a slow serve is a known, manageable weakness that a player can compensate for through footwork, anticipation, and physical hustle. On a body running on fumes after 7 matches in under 2 weeks, that same weakness stops being manageable. The extra movement required to cover for a hittable serve simply isn't available anymore. The split-second reactions needed to defend a second serve that's sitting up in a dangerous returner's strike zone start arriving a beat too late. What was a known, containable flaw on a fresh body becomes something closer to an open wound on an exhausted one. And Bencic, whether by scouting or simple instinct, attacked exactly that opening. This is why the critics being right isn't really a story about them being smarter than everyone else who was celebrating Eala's incredible run. It's a story about timing. The serve weakness was always there. It's been there in every match breakdown, every analyst clip, every fan conversation about what she'd need to improve to reach an even higher level. What changed in Toronto wasn't the weakness itself. What changed was the amount of physical reserve she had left to cover for it. And once that reserve ran out, the weakness that had been quietly sitting in the background of her entire breakout season suddenly became the deciding factor in a match that mattered. Let's go back through the specific moments in that Bencic match where this actually showed up on the scoreboard, because the shape of the collapse tells its own story. The first set was close, 6-4, competitive tennis that could have gone either way. Even within that first set, though, the signs were already visible if you knew where to look. Eala's first serve percentage was already trending low, and there were multiple points where Bencic stepped in aggressively on second serves and dictated the point from the very first shot. Eala was still finding ways to win enough of those exchanges to stay competitive, using her movement, her shot variety, her court sense to make up the difference. That's the fresher version of her compensating exactly the way she's compensated all season and all breakout year. But by the second set, the compensation mechanism broke down entirely. 6 straight games disappeared, and when you look specifically at what was happening on serve during that stretch, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Double faults at critical moments, second serves sitting up in exactly the strike zone Bencic wanted, first serves missing wide or long instead of finding the corners they needed to find to keep Bencic honest. This isn't what a tactical adjustment from an opponent usually looks like. This is what a structural weakness looks like once the player's ability to paper over it with movement and hustle simply isn't there anymore. Here's where I want to push back gently on the idea that this is purely a story of decline or purely a story of fatigue, because neither framing fully captures what actually happened, and neither framing gives Eala enough credit for what she'd already accomplished before this specific weakness caught up to her. Consider how much winning tennis she'd already played this season with a serve that analysts have openly criticized for well over a year now. She beat a former world #1 earlier this year with a first serve barely cracking 86 miles per hour. She won a WTA 500 title in Washington against a legitimate top 3 player without ever having the safety net of a dominant serve to lean on. She built an entire 7-match winning streak against a lineup that included a top 3 seed, a dangerous power hitter, and a Grand Slam champion, all while carrying this exact same weakness the entire time. If the serve alone were disqualifying at the level critics sometimes suggest, none of that run should have been possible in the first place. What that tells you is that Eala has built an entire competitive identity around succeeding despite this flaw, not despite pretending it doesn't exist, but by building every other part of her game strong enough to compensate for it. Elite movement, elite court sense, the ability to read rallies and redirect pace in ways that neutralize bigger hitters. A return game that's been specifically praised by analysts as one of the best on tour relative to her age and experience level. All of that compensates brilliantly for a serve that would sink most other players outright. But compensation isn't the same as elimination. A weakness that's been successfully hidden behind other strengths for an entire season doesn't stop being a weakness. It just waits for the exact conditions where those other strengths temporarily aren't available to cover for it. And Toronto, after 7 matches in under 2 weeks, was precisely that condition. So when the title says, "The critics were right," it's not saying Eala is a lesser player than her breakout season suggests. It's saying something more specific and more useful than that. It's saying the one part of her game that's always been flagged as unfinished business finally got tested under conditions where she had no reserve left to hide it, and the results were exactly what critics have been warning about for over a year. That's not an insult to everything else she's built. It's a signal about the single clearest area where continued improvement could take her from a dangerous, unpredictable competitor to something closer to a complete, sustained threat at the top of the rankings on a weekly basis, not just during hot stretches when everything else in her game happens to be firing perfectly. This actually raises the more interesting and more forward-looking question buried inside this whole story. What happens if this specific weakness gets addressed? Serve mechanics can be worked on. Racket speed, toss consistency, leg drive, all of these are trainable, coachable components of a serve, and plenty of players throughout tennis history have added meaningful pace and reliability to their serve over the course of a career through deliberate technical work, not through some sudden natural talent shift, but through hours of repetition and coaching focused specifically on that one shot. If Eala's team treats this Toronto loss not as a fluke to move past quickly, but as a genuine signal about where the next real improvement needs to happen, this could end up being one of the more useful losses of her entire career, the kind that redirects training priorities in a way that pays off for years rather than weeks. Think about what even a modest improvement would mean. If her first serve moved from the mid-80s into the low 90s, and her second serve climbed even 5 to 7 miles per hour, that's not a cosmetic change. That's the difference between a returner like Bencic getting a comfortable strike zone to attack from the first shot of the rally, and that same returner having to work significantly harder just to get a swing on the ball at all. It's the difference between every service game requiring an exhausting, extended battle, and at least some service games becoming quick, low-effort holds that conserve energy for the rest of the match. Given how much of Toronto's collapse was tied specifically to fatigue amplifying this exact weakness, even a small improvement in serve reliability could dramatically change how sustainable these long, multi-tournament stretches are for her going forward. There's also a psychological dimension to this that shouldn't be overlooked. Right now, opponents scouting Eala know exactly where to attack. That's not speculation, that's simply how professional tennis scouting works at this level. Every team preparing to face her is watching this exact match, seeing these exact numbers, and building a game plan specifically around stepping in on her second serve early and often. The longer this remains her most exploitable weakness without meaningful improvement, the more consistently future opponents will build their entire strategy around exactly what worked for Bencic in Toronto. That's the real cost of critics being proven right in a match like this one. It's not just about this single loss. It's about what every future opponent now has on film, confirmed with real statistics, showing them precisely where to apply pressure first. But here's the other side of that same coin, and it's worth sitting with because it cuts in Eala's favor just as much as it exposes a vulnerability. A player who has already proven she can beat elite, seeded opponents while carrying a known, well-scouted weakness the entire time is a player who has other tools significant enough to make that weakness survivable most of the time. Plenty of players with far more conventional, more powerful serves have never come close to winning a WTA 500 title, have never beaten a top 3 player in a comeback final, have never taken a set off a Grand Slam champion in the same 2-week stretch. Eala has already done all of that, without the safety net critics keep saying she needs. That's not a small accomplishment hiding behind an asterisk. That's evidence of a genuinely rare overall skill set, one good enough to produce elite results even while operating with a real, quantifiable disadvantage on one of the most important shots in the sport. So where does that leave the actual conversation about Toronto? It leaves it somewhere more nuanced than either extreme. This wasn't simply fatigue undoing an otherwise flawless performance, and it wasn't simply a long-standing weakness finally sinking a fraudulent run. It was the collision of both things at once. A real, well-documented technical limitation that had been successfully managed and compensated for through an entire historic stretch, finally meeting a moment where the physical reserves needed to keep managing it had run out completely. Critics who've been pointing at the serve for over a year weren't wrong about the weakness existing. They were simply waiting, whether they realized it or not, for the exact set of conditions that would finally let that weakness decide a result instead of getting quietly absorbed by everything else in her game. What happens from here matters more than the loss itself, just like it did with the fatigue conversation a few results back. A single loss, even one with numbers as stark as a 46% first serve win rate, doesn't define a career on its own. What actually determines whether Toronto becomes meaningful or forgettable is what her team does with the information sitting inside that result. If Eala's team uses this specific data point, not the general surface-level idea of she lost a match, but the actual granular breakdown of exactly how and where the serve broke down under pressure, which points she double-faulted on, which patterns Bencic exploited, which specific moments in the second set the serve simply stopped holding up its end of the bargain, then this Toronto result becomes one of the most useful losses of her young career. It becomes the kind of result that quietly funds real technical growth over the following months, the kind of data that a good coaching team treats as a gift rather than a setback, because it tells you precisely where to point the next several weeks of practice court time instead of guessing at it in the abstract. That's how the best development stories in this sport usually work. Rarely does a player wake up one day and decide to fix a weakness in the absence of any real evidence forcing the issue. Almost always, there's a specific match, a specific loss, a specific set of numbers that makes the problem undeniable and unavoidable. The kind of result that turns a vague, general sense of, I should probably work on my serve at some point, into an urgent, specific priority backed by real match data. Toronto could be exactly that kind of moment for Eala, if her team chooses to treat it that way. But there's a very real alternative path here too, and it's worth being honest about how likely that alternative actually is. If this gets treated as just a bad day tied only to exhaustion, if the story that gets told internally is simply, she was tired after an incredible 2 weeks and tired players lose matches, end of story, without ever addressing the underlying mechanical and tactical vulnerability that made that exhaustion so specifically costly in this exact match, then the same pattern is likely to repeat. Not necessarily next week, and not necessarily in an obvious, easy-to-spot way at first. But the next time she runs into a sharp, aggressive returner, someone who reads serves early and steps in with confidence the way Bencic did, on a day when her legs aren't fully fresh for whatever reason, whether that's a long previous match, a tough travel schedule, or just the accumulated wear of a long season, the exact same weakness will resurface. And eventually, if it keeps happening enough times, that pattern will stop being explainable purely by fatigue. At some point, if the serve numbers never actually improve, the excuse of tiredness runs out, and what's left is simply an unaddressed technical limitation that opponents have learned to target with increasing confidence every time they see her name on the draw sheet. So here's what I actually want to know from you, because I think this is a genuinely interesting debate with real disagreement possible on both sides. Do you think Eala's serve is a fixable technical issue? The kind of thing her team can meaningfully improve with focused, deliberate training, turning it into a real weapon within a year or two once the mechanics catch up to the rest of her game? Serve improvement is absolutely possible at the professional level. Plenty of players have added real pace and reliability to their serve through dedicated technical work over multiple off-seasons, so there's a legitimate case that this is simply a matter of time and coaching priority. Or do you think it's more of a permanent stylistic limitation, something she'll always have to compensate for through movement, court sense, and shot variety, rather than something that ever truly gets fixed at the mechanical level? There's precedent for that outcome too. Certain players throughout tennis history have built entire elite, decade-long careers around a genuinely modest serve, never turning it into a real strength, but instead building every other part of their game strong enough that the serve simply stopped being the deciding factor in most matches. Both paths have real examples behind them, which is exactly why there's no obvious, easy answer here. Drop your take in the comments because I think this conversation actually says a lot about how you personally view player development as a whole. Whether you believe genuine technical weaknesses can be coached away even at the highest professional level, or whether some limitations simply get managed and compensated for across an entire career rather than eliminated outright. And stick around for how her serve numbers look in her very next tournament, because that's really the test that tells us everything we need to know going forward. If the percentages stay stuck exactly where they were in Toronto, this becomes a recurring theme that critics will keep pointing to every single time she runs into a sharp, confident returner. But if those numbers start climbing, even modestly, even just a few miles per hour or a few percentage points at a time, that's the clearest signal we'll get that this loss became the turning point, the exact moment that pushed her team toward finally fixing the one part of her game that's been quietly holding her back the entire time everyone else was busy celebrating everything else she was doing right.